Hello, everybody. Pat DeSerbo here, the most fascinating podcast in the world. Nothing to do with me, it's all about the guests. I have here with me today Dan Runde. Dan is with CSIS, it's a well known think tank in Washington, D.C. It is a bipartisan think tank, and Dan has a great background, and we're going to talk about that a little bit. We met recently at the Columbus Citizens Foundation in New York City, where he gave a very informative presentation that involved his experience and research, as well as a new book that he has written called The American Imperative. But I figured before we get started, Dan, maybe I could ask you a few questions about your background. Would that be okay?
Sure. I'm thrilled to be on your podcast. Thanks, Pat, for having me.
Welcome. Thank you. Where'd you grow up, Dan?
I grew up in Chappaqua, New York. I'm one of three siblings. My father commuted to New York every day for 40 years. He was with Morgan Stanley for a long time, which I think many of your listeners will be familiar with.
Mm-hmm.
And my mom was a stay-home mom, and I'm the oldest of three. I went to the local public high school called Horace Greeley in Chappaqua, and then I went to Dartmouth and I studied political science there. Then I did a couple of years on Wall Street at what's now Deutsche Bank. It was Alex Brown and Sons at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And then I went to, after some time, I went to the Kennedy School at Harvard where I took a degree in public policy I have an interest at the intersection of business and government. And I met my wife, who's from Argentina, and I spoke pretty good Spanish, and so I moved to Argentina, and I spent 3 years living in Argentina. We got married down there, and I had done some research work in grad school for a guy named Andrew Natsios, who became the head of USAID, which is the foreign aid arm of the American government, in 2001. I had done research for him a couple of years before,
Mm-hmm.
and I had also and so when he became the head of AID and I was leaving Argentina, he took me with him and I got a job at the foreign aid arm of the U.S. government. By this time, I'd worked at Citibank and a commercial bank, and I'd served on a number of nonprofit boards. I'd worked on Wall Street, and so yeah, I went to work for the American government in the foreign aid world. Learned about international development and soft power, things I'm happy to talk about. And then I did that for 5 years, and I helped organize and stand up. I kind of joined sort of in the second inning or third inning, an initiative of working, setting up partnerships among the business sector, the nonprofit sector, and the government sector to solve big problems. So I did that for about 5 years. I ended up running it for a time. And then I went to the World Bank Group. I went to the International Finance Corporation, and I was there for 4 years. And so I learned a lot about what the World Bank does and is, and what the International Finance Corporation is and does, and what an institution called the Development Finance Institution is and does. So it was great. And then I came to CSIS about 13 years ago. I have an endowed chair here, and I'm a senior person here, and I work on basically what I would describe as American soft power and how do we apply it around the world for a more prosperous and freer world and for our out of our, out of working out of our enlightened self-interest, if I can put it that way. So I've been at CSIS a long time. I
Mm-hmm.
sit on a number of boards.
Mm-hmm. So I've only met you recently, but you seem very passionate. This is more than a business for you. I feel like you're a very patriotic American. And what do you see happening in the world right now? Like, what's on your mind?
So yeah, I'm definitely a mission-driven person. I mean, I could go do other things with my energy and efforts, but I'm really interested in ensuring. I think the American-led system set up after World War II, called the Liberal International Order, and those are big words, but it's basically the rules system that was set up at the end of World War II has been a really great thing. We haven't had a third world war. We haven't had a nuclear war. A whole bunch of things have been allowed to happen. Global trade has happened under that umbrella. More scientific progress has happened under that umbrella. Progress on democracy and better governance and human rights have happened under that umbrella. Globalization, as we understand it on this podcast, have been undergirded by that system. And I think that there have been challenges to that system. And I'm interested in ensuring that for the next 100 years, that system largely remains. And that I see the Chinese Communist Party and Vladimir Putin's murderous regime and a bunch of sort of other governments that are kind of look like the governments in the Star Wars bar,
Mm-hmm.
wanting to kind of put a coalition of bad guys together to try and undo that system or overthrow that system and set up a parallel system.
Mm.
Some people argue about that, say, well, maybe that's an exaggeration. I don't think so. And so I'm particularly interested. I wrote a book because I've been looking out at the world. I've been in maybe about 100 countries, Pat.
Mm-hmm.
I meet with lots of different folks. I just look at the world and I think that, the United States is going to need to continue to lead and pay the condo fees of global leadership if we want to have the current system to remain.
Mm.
And if you did a thought exercise, if anyone of your listeners said, okay, well, what's a world led by the Chinese Communist Party like? If you just spent 30 seconds thinking about things you most cared about, environmental stewardship, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of who you want to marry, freedom where you want to live, kind of job you want to have, what kind of like level, some minimum level of privacy and some levels of civil liberties. Like, does anyone on this on your listening to this think that the Chinese Communist Party would be a better steward of that than the United States of America and the West? The answer is no. And so I've done about, this is my 69th book talk,
Mm.
and I've gone in every one of them and I've said, is anyone here, want to, I haven't met anybody, any American citizen yet that has said, man, I would really like to hand the reins over to the Chinese Communist Party. That would be great. I'd love to entrust the world to the Chinese. I haven't met anybody yet in the United States. There are people in the global South, which is sort of an inaccurate and kind of an imprecise term, that will sometimes say that to me, generally just to kind of be to tweak, to
Mm.
kind of be obnoxious. But I'm not even sure they believe that. So I
Mm.
would just say that, I think, but the problem is that for the last 15 years, Pat, we've had, I think, a lot of exhaustion. Some of it's the Iraq War, some of it's Afghanistan, some of it's the financial crisis of 2008. I think there was sort of a sense in the United States that we'd like to have a vacation from leadership. We'd like to have a time out from leadership. That's different than saying, hey, Chinese Communist Party, I'll give you the reins I'll give you the keys and you can kind of drive the car now. Like, I don't see that. But I see a temptation in the United States and our politics towards, I'd like a timeout, but you don't get a timeout. And the other thing is, like, for us to continue to lead, we have to pay the condo fees of global leadership, and there's different ways of doing that. But there's been a lot of benefit. Net, we've had a lot of benefits, and if it goes away, and this world is set up, instead of having a dollar, you have the renminbi, or some funny money digital currency run by China. I mean, you're in the finance world. You tell me what kind of a world that's like if we're trading in renminbi or some funny money Chinese digital something or other.
Mm.
We're not going to like that. So I think you're not going to like what that means in terms of the rule set that comes with that and the kind of decisions they make. I
Mm.
mean, this is an authoritarian regime where they just disappeared the foreign minister. Like
Mm.
the guy just disappeared 4 weeks ago. And they're like, hey, let's think about it. Like if Secretary Powell or Secretary Rice or Secretary Blinken was like, hey, we don't know what happened to the Secretary of State and we can't talk about it. And there's a media blackout. What the heck? I mean, that's
Mm.
a crazy system.
Mm.
And so we're gonna like entrust the global system to some authoritarian murderous regime that represses minorities? Hell no. So we got a lot of problems in this country. And your listeners and I and you, Pat, we could put a list together of all the challenges and our imperfections and shortcomings. There's a lot of them in this country, but I'd rather be us than them.
Mm-hmm.
It's not so great. What moves me, Pat, is I, I I wrote the book because I think we're in a new area of challenge, And the Chinese Communist Party and Russia as their sidekick, the murderous regime of Vladimir Putin, have an ability to fill voids today that they couldn't 25 years ago.
Mm.
So if we leave a void, we have to understand that there's a real good chance that the Chinese Communist Party is going to fill it. And so we have to think differently. A lot of this competition isn't military, it's non-military. And so I wrote this book saying we need a non-military strategy. We need a we need to think about all the non-military tools in our toolkit and engage on that as opposed to, something else. So
Mm.
yeah. So that's what gets me up in the morning. So I made a commitment. I said I'm going to do 100 book talks. I'm going to write this. If I write this book and it just sits on a shelf, I'm silly.
Hmm.
And if I just think people are just kind of stumble onto it or discover it, I'm also silly. So I was really excited when you reached out to me, Pat, because like I'm trying to talk to as many. My goal is if I do 100 book talks, I figure I don't know, I'll have hit 300,000 people, sort of, kind of, or 400,000 people, and then I'll feel like I want 400,000 to 500,000 people kind of engage with the ideas of my book. That's what I want. Now, do I want people to buy my book? Sure. The American Imperative by Dan Runde. Sure, I want people to buy that book,
Hmm.
but I'm not really in it for selling books. I'm not going to pay my kids college tuition on the sale of the book. But
Hmm.
what I do want to do is I want people to engage with the ideas in the book because I think they're important ideas. That's why I spent 2 years of my life writing it and selling it and putting it together and everything. And now I'm spending a year of my life
Hmm.
kind of evangelizing because
Hmm.
I think it's such an important topic.
Mm, me too. Like the word stewardship comes to mind when you talk about the post World War II initiative. And I feel like it's a game of inches and the stakes are super high. Um, Soft power, you've mentioned it a couple times. And to me, it's a sort of nebulous. I don't get a vivid picture in my mind of what soft power is, Dan. Can you
It's very nebulous. Yeah,
can you talk a little bit about soft power?
absolutely. So I think a couple of things. So I've used a couple of nebulous terms in this conversation so far. So the global south is a nebulous term and an imprecise term. And what it kind of means is like the other words for it either can be kind of, controversial or provocative but it's basically developing countries. Um, and some people don't like that term, so people have used the global south. So I'm just using the global south because it seems to me like that's easier and that feels safe. Soft power. So it's sort of like I know what it looks like when I see it, Pat, in the sense of what do I mean is so Joe Nye had a term for soft power and he really kind of came up with the term to mean things that you use you persuade people to do something that you want them to do. I'm using a different way of defining it by in the sense that we have military power, we have F-16s and we have battleships. That's not really necessarily soft power. And I don't necessarily consider most of our intelligence work. Some of the intelligence work sort of betwixt and between diplomacy and military. But I would say some of it's our diplomacy, like our straight up diplomats talking to other diplomats. Some of it's things like our foreign aid. Some of it's things that I describe as foreign aid adjacent. So things like the Export Import Bank or the Development Finance Corporation, or what's called commercial diplomacy, which is trying to get people to engage with American businesses in different ways. Some of it's public diplomacy. How do we strategically communicate with the rest of the world and talk to the rest of the world? That's things like uh, there's the there's a number of institutions that were set up to kind of do different forms of public diplomacy that we've had over time. Some of it's things like the Peace Corps, which is not really a development program, but it's sort of a public diplomacy program. And also, everyone on this call has heard of the Peace Corps, but some of them may have done it, but may not sure what it is. Some of it's things like long-term education and training. And so, if you've been to a university and you studied, at an American university, you'll have seen there were a lot of foreign students. That's a really important thing. We underestimate how important that is. Having Americans, foreign students in American university is a good thing.
Can you talk more about that and what's changed over the past 30 years
Yeah,
because of it?
yeah, we did a report on this too at CSIS, and I wrote a chapter in my book about this. But I'm really on a tear on this because what we want is if somebody studies at Harvard, we want that person when they grow up to become finance minister in their country or central bank president in their country, we want them to have Boston on the speed dial, not Beijing on the speed dial.
Hmm.
Now, what happened was 60 years ago in a lot of developing countries, there were some universities in some of the post colonial states, but there's maybe one. And so we used a lot of our foreign aid to train maybe up to maybe 20,000 students a year using American tax dollars. And these are people who studied all over the University of New Mexico and agricultural economics. So people who went on to be health ministers and central bank ministers and finance ministers and agriculture ministers and urban planners. A lot of them got PhDs or master's degrees in the United States, and they went back home. We had like several waves of people, 60,000 people or 100,000 people over sort of a 30 or 40-year period. Those people all became friends of the United States, had positive views of the United States, and sort of, were comfortable with us, spoke English. What's happened is a whole bunch of things have happened. Well, there's a lot of wealth. There's more wealth in the developing world and the global south. And so some people can go to school in their own country now. There's a whole series of universities that have sprung up. In my book, I talk about the Ashesi University, on whose American Foundation Board I sit in Ghana.
Hmm.
You have you also have people who can finance their own studies in the United States. There's like entire cohorts of generations of people who can now pay for out of pocket to study from overseas, and that's a good thing. And then you now have also China's taken a playbook from us, and they offer, instead of $70,000 a year at Columbia, at Tsinghua it's like $7,000 a year. So they can take a much bigger number of folks for the same amount of money. So we have to understand that. So when I go to a developing country, I ask two questions now, Pat. I ask, where do you buy your weapon systems from? Because when you buy guns and big complicated helicopters and planes, those come with experts and advisors and long-term training back in the home country. And you got to buy spare parts, and you have a dependency or interdependency relationship with that country for the next 40 or 50 years when you buy a weapon system. The second question I ask is, where do you send your elites to study? So if they say, well, many of our folks are going to China, that's a problem. That's a problem for us. Not a problem for China. China's smart. They're saying, hey, I'll help train nurses for you. I'll train doctors for you. I'll train agricultural economists for you. Well, that's something we need to pay attention to and understand that that's like a serious thing. So I
Hmm.
would just say that um, the landscape for higher education has changed. There's still a need for, I think, some targeted investments of American tax dollars to educate elites. And I don't think we have to be paying necessarily for MBAs or law degrees, but PhDs in economics, urban planning, agriculture, public health. Yeah, I think we should do that, or medical doctors if necessary. If we, on occasion, I think we should do that.
Hmm.
So I'm in favor of spending a little bit more money in an intentional, targeted way for this, because it has all. Now the problem is, people will say, well, there's two problems. One is you have someone come study at Harvard and they meet Mr. or Miss Right, and then they want to stay
Hmm.
instead of going back home.
Hmm.
The second problem is they say, well, per beneficiary it's really darn expensive. And they're right. Those are two criticisms that are true. The what's missing though is, like, if you take the 10 or 15 or 20-year view, there's huge upside in that investment, because a lot of those people go on to be finance minister or foreign minister or health minister, and they have us on the speed dial for life. And so we've got an enormous amount of informal influence that we wouldn't have. So
Friends.
we got friends. So
Hmm.
you know what our superpower is, Pat? We have friends.
Hmm.
One of our superpowers is, like the kids today, they're talking about like, what's your superpower?
Hmm.
One of our superpowers as a country is we have friends. Another superpower we have is we have allies. So people to people friends, business friends, diplomatic friends. Now, sometimes we're a crappy friend. We're kind of an unreliable friend. We're a little ADD as a friend. We're a little, we flit from here to there. It's
Mm.
hard for us to pay attention.
We all have friends
You know,
like that.
we all have friends like that, and we love those people, but they're annoying too.
Not
So
reliable,
we can
but they're our
not
friends.
reliable. They're fun, right? And so I hope we're like that fun but unreliable friend, as opposed to like the not fun unreliable friend.
Yeah.
So I think we need to do a better job of being a little bit more reliable. In this
Mm.
age, we can't just sort of take our friends for granted,
Mm.
especially friends that are kind of fence sitters and could kind of go either way. We have to be a little bit more. We need to be a little bit more, have a little bit more humility, and be a little bit engage a little bit more with our friends. And we can't just say you're going to do this or you're going to do that. And how would I don't like it when people tell me that, and I'm sure our friends don't like it when we do that.
Mm.
So we need to be careful when we do that. We got to pick our spots.
It's interesting. Like, as you know, I've made a career of local diplomacy, if you will. I have
Yeah.
lots of people that don't want to talk to me, but once I have lunch with them or breakfast, we're friends. We develop a relationship. It doesn't mean there's a business relationship, but there's some form of a friendship. And I've always thought of diplomacy on a grand scale as nothing more than that. It's just people. Like they say, all politics is local. I believe that, and I believe if you and I have lunch, we'll develop some kind of understanding and a friendship.
I 100% agree with that. And so part of life is, Woody Allen said, half of life is showing up.
Mm-hmm.
We got to show up, and we've got to so for example, China has more embassies today than the United States has.
Mm-hmm.
So think about that.
Mm.
So if you want to have friends, you got to show up. So we need to have embassies. So if you're someone who doesn't think of, like, what do these diplomats do? They just
Mm.
go to cocktail parties and drink champagne. Well, it's a lot more than that. It's a
Mm-hmm.
little bit to your point, Pat, about like being able to talk to people
Mm-hmm.
and say, I'm concerned about this and I
Mm-hmm.
need your help with that. And we really are concerned about this environmental challenge, or we're really concerned about drugs,
Mm-hmm.
or we really are worried, we need your help helping. We've got a challenge with our neighbor. Will you be a partner to us on that?
Mm-hmm.
So you got to be able to show up, and you got to have lunch, and you got to listen. So some of it's just about, just like anything else, your listeners. And so I think having, diplomacy is important. Development, so international development, our foreign aid is often kind of misunderstood and easily maligned. There have been problems, and there are problems with our foreign aid system, and I talk about it in our book,
Mm-hmm.
my book, The American Imperative: Reclaiming Global Leadership Through Soft Power.
Mm-hmm.
But um, I think net, it's a really important thing, and there have been a lot of successes with our foreign aid that I
Mm-hmm.
talk about in the book.
How does the world view us right now when you think in terms of our foreign aid? Like, what are you hearing?
So if you go to a place like Africa, we're really, really well liked
Mm-hmm.
because of the HIV/AIDS program that was set up by George W. Bush 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
We've saved tens of millions of lives and has changed the trajectory of the continent of Africa. I don't think that's a baloney statement,
Mm-hmm.
Pat. That's a real statement.
Mm-hmm.
If you go to Colombia, with our Plan Colombia, we're well liked and well remembered because of Plan Colombia. I think we're pretty appreciated right now in Ukraine, where we're providing a lot of aid. We're planting guns, and we're also keeping the lights on.
Mm-hmm.
So you need to have a functioning state. You got to pay cops and teachers and doctors, and we're using our foreign aid to do that. And we're also paying for the guns, and that's really important too, because we got to make sure that they have a decisive military win against the Russians. Because what we want, Pat, is for the Russians to say, boy, that was a really bad decision. I think I'm going to take a timeout on trying to invade Ukraine for
Mm-hmm.
100 years. You never hear the Russians say, I want to invade Finland. And
Mm-hmm.
if you both know, and your listeners will recall, that the Soviet Union invaded Finland in the late 30s, and
Mm-hmm.
it was a huge mistake. And so they never go around talking loosely like, oh, I think I'm going to turn left at Finland and try and invade Finland. They don't say that.
It's,
What we want is for the Russians to say, man, that was such a bad, I
mm-hmm.
really burned my fingers on Ukraine. I think I'm going to take a timeout.
You want it
So
to
we
be.
want is for them to take a timeout. They may, in their heart of hearts, and you give them couple shots of vodka, So yeah, I really would like to get Kiev back. I want Kiev, which I think is baloney. Or Ukraine deserves to be an independent country. It is an independent country and has its own history and its own distinct society.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of Russians, unfortunately, don't believe that. And we need to kind of engage them on that and and change that. But I think ultimately, um, so around the world, we're well liked in lots of places, and in other places, not so much.
Mm-hmm.
There's some places we need to show up more. We need to show up more in the Pacific Island countries.
Mm.
We need to show up more in the Pacific Island countries. China's making a big play. We've taken those countries for granted.
Like
We ought to
which
be.
ones are you thinking of?
There's like six. It depends on how you slice and dice them, Pat. But let's. It's
You
a
talk
region the
in the book a
size.
little bit about it.
Yeah, yeah. There's like 16 or 19 of them.
Mm-hmm.
So there's three of them that are called compact states. Don't hold me to the exact names.
Mm-hmm.
One of them for sure is Micronesia.
Mm-hmm.
There's Nauru. There's Kiribati. There's Papua New Guinea. There's the Solomon Islands. Oh my gosh, I don't know if I'm going to be able to name all these,
Mm-hmm.
but there's a lot of them, and it's across an entire geographic space in the Pacific, the size of Africa. So some of them, we have some kind of almost sort of like a protectorate status of three of them. Some of them have a unique relationship with Australia,
Mm-hmm.
and all of them, especially the ones closer in to China, China's making a huge play. They're sending tourists. They're offering to build infrastructure. They're paying for training of the young people. Right, I was talking earlier about education.
Mm-hmm.
So if you ask, some of these countries, where are you sending your kids to learn? They say, well, I'm going to Beijing. That's not such a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
Or if you ask, where's all your tourists coming from? Well, they're all coming from Beijing. That's also can be a dangerous thing too, because they'll say, okay, well, I'll just cut off the tourists. They've
Mm-hmm.
done that in a lot of places as a form of leverage.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the Pacific Islands are a place we need to pay more attention. I think we have an ADD relationship with Central America. I think to the Biden administration's credit, they're trying to pay more attention to the region. And I think it's hard, but I think it's important.
Why is it
I also,
important?
well, I think we have a migration challenge on our southern border. And
Mm-hmm.
a lot of that is because for a number of different reasons. Some of it's about security issues, gangs.
Mm-hmm.
Some of it's because of poverty and economic opportunity. So you have, if you look in my book, I talk about that the magic number is 8,000. When a country hits $8,000 per capita, people stop migrating.
Mm-hmm.
So in Panama, the GMP per capita is 12,000. In Mexico, it's like 10 or 12,000. In Costa Rica, it's like 12,000. So you don't have a lot of migrants from Costa Rica.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have a lot of migrants from Panama. Net, you don't have a lot of migrants from Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
You actually have up until COVID, you were having a net migration of more people coming back to Mexico than leaving
Mm-hmm.
Mexico. So you have a migration from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. Guatemala and El Salvador have a GMP per capita about $4,000 per capita, and Honduras has a GMP per capita about $2,500 per
Mm-hmm.
capita. So, I think we are, so we need to engage in those countries partially because we have a migration challenge, partially because also we consume a lot of illicit drugs.
Mm-hmm.
And so some of the problems in those countries have been exacerbated by our consumption of illicit drugs. It's
Mm-hmm.
corrupted their police and military, their political system. It's provided weapons and arms to the gangs so that the law enforcement are outgunned. It's also reduced people's trust in their system. And so it's a real challenge. So I think that um, we have a shared responsibility and a shared future. We have a shared future with the rest of the Western Hemisphere. So they're our neighbors and our friends and partners. And so sometimes when friends are having a hard time, and sometimes if we brought some of this is indirectly or partially our fault, I think we've got a stake in showing up.
Mm-hmm. Can we go back to the Pacific Islands for a minute? Like, why
Yeah,
is it
sure.
important for us to be investing in the Pacific Islands?
So the Pacific Islands overall are maybe about 20 million people. But if you look on a map, the importance of it is geography.
Mm-hmm.
So most of the world's most of the world's trade, 90% of the world's trade travels on boats. And there's a series of important choke points. One of them is the Malacca Straits,
Mhm.
MALACCA Strait.
Mhm.
And the other thing is that China has a grand strategy of pushing back the United States beyond what's called the first and the second island chains.
Mhm.
They basically like us to like go back to Hawaii and not engage in the rest of the Pacific.
Mhm.
That's what they straight up want to do. So these Pacific Islands, if you remember World War II, like there was like Guadalcanal and Iwo Jima. There's a series of famous battles in these
Mhm.
Pacific Islands.
Mhm.
There's a reason for that. So unfortunately, they're very strategically located. And so China would like to get control, indirect control of those islands so that if there was ever a war with the United States and our allies could not come to the aid of Japan, or the United States could not come to the aid of the Philippines, or the
Mhm.
United States could not come to the aid of Australia, or the United States could not come to the aid of Vietnam, or the United States could not come to the aid of Taiwan. So this is about preparing the battle space if they decided they wanted to have a shooting war. Now we should hope and pray there's no shooting war,
Mhm.
and we should work to prevent that. One of the ways to prevent that is to make it hard for them to make sure that you keep the Pacific Islands on our side as opposed to on their side,
Mhm.
because it makes it easier for us to respond and it makes it more risky for them. So that's part of what it is. Yeah,
Mhm.
and there's a lot of development challenges there: governance, health, education,
Mhm.
economic diversity, health, and other things.
Can we talk a little bit about? I heard you speak about investing in Africa, for example, and people say, "Well, big deal. Why should we invest in Africa?" I don't understand. But you told some interesting stories about why the Chinese are investing in places like the Congo. I think you mentioned.
So look, so there's 54 African countries.
Hmm.
There are a billion Africans today. 25 years from now, so most of your listeners will be alive 25 years from now, there'll be 2 billion Africans. In a world, there'll be like something like the largest youth cohort in the world is going to be in Africa.
Mm.
There's something like, depending on how you slice it, about 300 million middle class in Africa today. Sometime in the next 10 years, half of Africa will be urban. There's something like 700 million cell phones just today in Africa.
Mm.
And they've leapfrogged a whole bunch of things, whether it's e payments or cell phones. And so you've got a young population that needs jobs. And young people do several things. They either migrate, they go to school, they get a job, some kind of constructive job, or they use their energies in non-constructive ways. And we can like list what those your listeners understand what non-constructive ways mean.
Hmm.
Whether it's in the LA, whether it's in Central America, whether it's Africa, whether it's the Middle East, young people do four things with their energy. So it's in our interest to see Africa is a business opportunity. But if you look at the New York Times coverage, there was a study done like maybe 10 years ago over like a 20-year period. Something like 90 or 95% of all the coverage in the New York Times of Africa was negative. But yeah, it's like saying if you live in New York City or you live in DC, like everything is you produced only coverage, negative coverage of New York City or DC. Africa is a really big place. I mean, a really big place, far bigger than the continental United States, and it's got more people. And so as a result, we seem to, not understand that, this many people have not been, and there's just some really amazing, beautiful places. The people, it's very hard to generalize about a billion people
Hmm.
and 54 countries. But what I would say to you is also a lot of our future is going to be tied to Africa.
Hmm.
If you want to have a carbon transition, you want to move away from oil and gas, we're going to have a lot of minerals and mining, cobalt and lithium and other stuff. A lot of that's in Africa.
Hmm.
China is going up and buying up a lot of these mines in kind of a neo-colonial move.
Hmm.
They're also running all the telecom systems in Africa. So the digital rails of the future, the e-payments, the data sensitive stuff is traveling over Huawei telephone lines or the equivalent of cell phone lines or whatever you want to call it but the digital rails of the future are being controlled by China
Mm.
in Africa. So 25 years ago, probably 0 countries on the continent, China was the number one trading partner.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to guess today, at least 15 or 20 countries on the continent, the number one trading partner is Africa. That has all sorts of implications.
Mm.
It's also a big financier. It's substituted other institutions and Wall Street or big money banks or the IMF. A lot of the financing, much of the financing in Africa is China. And so there have been a series of defaults. You're in the financial world, Pat, so you're probably more closer to this, but there's a whole series of debt crises in a lot of developing countries. The biggest debt holder is Africa, and they're unwilling to write down the debt, and they're unwilling to share what the agreement was.
So the
Like, well, how long
biggest
was it?
debt holder is China,
Yeah,
and they're unwilling to.
yeah, right, deal,
Right.
right?
So how does
So
what? Why does that matter? What happens when that?
well, what happens is a couple of things. One is if you're a poor country, and China says, "I don't care, you got to pay your debt." That means like if you got a spare dollar, you're going to pay interest on China to pay for your kids in school. Or if you got a spare dollar, you're going to pay less in infrastructure or healthcare. Or if you decide, well, I'm going to, if you don't pay back, it has all sorts of impacts in terms of your economy and creates those sort of distortions, or it's hard for you to import stuff because you need hard currency or this sort of a thing. So
Mm-hmm.
it has a whole series of negative impacts, and it creates a problem for the West because those countries would historically say, well, I'm in trouble, I need to go to the International Monetary Fund, which is led by the United States and the West. And so the plumbers and carpenters of the United States who pay their taxes are indirectly going to subsidize and bail out poor countries in Africa so they can turn around and pay off in full $100, 100 cents on the dollar.
It seems like kind of different. Like when I was a kid and you were a kid, we
Yeah,
loaned money to all these Central and South American countries, but then we forgave the debt. It sounds to me like the Chinese are loaning money to people, and when they get in a pinch, they're not forgiving the debt. So the
you got it.
consequences are different.
You got it. And so there's been lots of polite meetings of the G7 and the G20 and the IMF and China and the Paris Club, which is kind of as you know, Pat, is a club of of lenders,
Hmm.
and China is not a member of it. And so there's like a series of Marquis of Queensberry rules of what you're supposed to do when you lend money, and China doesn't follow it. And so now we're having lots of fancy pronouncements and fancy meetings saying, hey, you need to say how much money you lend.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, you need to say, is it a 3-year loan or a 20-year loan?
Mm-hmm.
Hey, you need to tell me what kind of collateral you put on that loan. And so you're seeing that with things like, well, in the small print, with things like that port in Sri Lanka that got a lot of global press. The Sri Lankans couldn't pay the money back, and the Chinese said, well, on page 6, it says I get the port. And so they took the port. So you could see a wave of assets being taken over by China that also happen to be convenient for them to take over.
Mm-hmm.
So like having a port in Sri Lanka would allow them to have a naval base in Sri Lanka,
Mm-hmm.
right? As they think about how things, so you see what I mean? So there's a whole bunch of bad stuff that going. But Africa, beyond being an area of competition with China, we need to see Africa not as a place Africa is got an enormous potential. There's a lot of positive things happening on the continent. It gets a lot, doesn't get a lot of good press. The only thing, think of like in the last month, what press stories have come out of Africa that you've read?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to say which ones, but you can think about them. They're all are almost 100% negative.
Mm-hmm.
So I just think that it's very difficult to for the so I think China sees Africa as a partner. China has a long history in a lot of these countries. In places like Tanzania, they've been there for 60 years.
Mm-hmm.
You could argue that they've had long-term trading relationships with the east coast of Africa for thousands of years.
Mm-hmm.
So they see Africa as a partner and as a friend. And many Africans are sympathetic to China, though sometimes the way China treats countries in Africa isn't so great. So we don't necessarily have that as the United States. We don't have that problem. Some of our European friends bring baggage, colonial
Hmm.
baggage. We don't have colonial baggage on the continent of Africa. We have the terrible legacy of slavery,
Mm.
but at the same time, it's meant that we have an African American diaspora that has a lot of engagement and interest in Africa, and that's been I'm not going to call that it's been something that's allowed us to have connectivity with the continent in a positive way. But we need many other ways to connect with the continent, and so having Peace Corps volunteers on the continent's good. Having foreign aid on the continent's good. But really, what we need are people to make business on the continent. We need to have tens of thousands of Americans of all of every kind of American see Africa as a business opportunity.
So
And
when I was a kid, like my dad used to say, there's certain people you would want to stay away from and don't ever borrow money from them, kind of stuff like that. And I would think if I were a developing nation, if you'll forgive the term,
yeah, sure.
there are certain countries that I would be reluctant to borrow money from. So in that way, I would think the U.S. would be a much more attractive lender than China, for example. So it doesn't seem like it'd be difficult for us if we wanted to employ your strategies. What am I missing?
So some of it is we have been distracted. Some of it is we've wanted to take a time out. Some of it is that I partially wrote this book because I want to engage folks that might be kind of internationalist skeptical. And there's a large swath of Americans. So, I mean, we have our future is tied to the rest of the world. Our kids' future is impacted by what happens in the rest of the world. Our businesses are impacted by what happens in the rest of the world, and our security is impacted by what happens in the rest of the world. We have to engage in a constructive way and in constructive ways with the rest of the world. So, my point and the reason I wrote this book was to say, look, much of our challenge with China is going to be in a non-military competition, and it's going to play out largely in the. It's not going to play out in China, and it's not going to play out in Russia. It's going to play out in Africa. It's going to play out in the Pacific Island states. It's going to play out in Central Asia. It's going to play out in Latin America. It's going to play out in Ukraine and Moldova.
Mm.
So much of that competition is look. I'm all for a 500 ship navy. I'm all for providing the Ukrainians with all the weapons they need. But a lot of this is also going to be about things like who runs the International Monetary Fund? Who sets the global rules of the game? What kind of rules do we have for the internet? What kind of what kind of vaccines are people going to take? Right? And what kind of values are we going to live by? We're going to try and live by democracy and human rights and like not, some kind of rule of law of some kind or some kind of horrible authoritarian, you know, Frankenstein Marxist something or other, right? Then that's kind of the choice. I mean, I'm not going to say that's the only. I mean, so there's a competition for systems as well, and it's an issue.
Hmm. So, like, is it unlikely at this point you would get on a plane to China or Russia?
I would absolutely not get on a plane. I would absolutely not get on a plane to Russia,
Hmm.
and I would discourage people from going to Russia.
Mm.
There was an article in the Wall Street Journal, I think in the last 72 hours, talking about like people don't want to go to mainland China because of all the risk and the headache.
Mm.
And so I would ask your listeners, who do they know in their friends network who's graduating from college or business school and saying, I am moving to Moscow?
Mm.
How many people in your friends network or your professional network are saying, I am moving to Beijing and making my career there? I don't think anybody is.
Mm.
Anybody serious. You're also not hearing people say, like, I am so desperate to leave Vietnam, I'm going to cross the border and move to mainland China in an illicit, illegal, or undocumented way, whatever you want to call it.
Mm.
You also don't have a lot of people these days saying, "Oh man, I am so desperate in Kyrgyzstan." There are some. I'm so desperate, I'm going to migrate to Russia. There are some, but you don't see wave upon wave. There are some, but not recently. It's not a super attractive place.
Hmm.
So I just think that says a number of different things. But I would say, yeah, I don't really think I'd want it. No, and so I personally wouldn't want to go. I'm discouraging my kids
Mm.
from wanting to do that. Okay, but I will say this. So, okay, we can go too far on this, Pat, because I do think let me go back to this international education thing. I actually do think we need to find ways to engage Chinese people and
Agreed.
Russian people. We don't have a, and I say this in all my talks. We don't have a problem with the Chinese people, and we don't have a problem with the Russian people. But we need to find constructive ways to engage with the Russian people and engage with Chinese people.
Hmm.
And we need to do so in a way that, uh, it supports democracy and supports human rights movements and civil society movements in those countries. So
Hmm.
we need to find ways to engage. So at the same time, I don't want to go, but at the same time, we need to find ways to engage. So I know I'm saying two different things. I recognize
Right.
that.
So at the moment, like it almost feels like a Cold War, even though it hasn't been talked about that way. What do you, how
Yeah,
would
so I
you?
100%. Okay, I'm really glad you raised it. So I do not use in my book, The American Imperative. I do not use the term a Cold War on
Hmm.
purpose, and I explicitly say we're not in a Cold War.
Hmm.
But a lot of people in Washington, even since the publication of that book 18 months ago, when I submitted the manuscript almost 18 months ago, increasingly you hear that phrase. I worry about it because there's a little bit of painting ourselves into a corner, and there's a little bit of a finality to it that I
Hmm.
worry about. So I would just say that I've tried to eschew that term because I'd like to see us not use that term. I think it's got there's a lot of negatives associated with it.
Hmm.
So I don't use that term, but I know it's a term that many people use. It's a little, I don't want to say it's too simplistic, but I just think that I've
Inflammatory.
tried to stay, it's a little inflammatory. So I've tried
Hmm.
to stay away from it.
So I know you have another appointment coming up. I just want to ask you, like, why is this so important to you right now? It's like I said before, it sounds to me like I almost hear like a father thinking about his children, trying to hoping for a better world than what he sees coming. Um, in your heart of hearts, like, what are you thinking right
So
now?
I think if I would ask your listeners to go back to this thought exercise. Do you want a world led by the Chinese Communist Party and Vladimir Putin's murderous regime? Because they would like that. They'd like to kick us off, and the West, they'd basically like to replace us with a horrible system.
Hmm.
And so I don't want that for me and my kids. And we're not going to, if you kind of think through what that means, it's a really bad outcome for us and our children. So we've been beneficiaries. We're like fish in water, so we don't kind of fully appreciate the value of kind of this arrangement that we've had for 80 years. I'd
Mm.
like it for another 180 years. Frankly, I'd
Hmm.
like it for another 300 years.
Hmm.
And I just think if we don't get to a shooting war with mainland China over the next 20 years, their demography stinks and they got a lot of challenges. And the
Hmm.
Russians have a lot of challenges. So if they don't, the Russians don't do anything crazy, they're doing something horrible and awful right now. But if they don't start a land war with NATO or they don't use nuclear weapons, and if the Chinese don't invade Taiwan, I like the odds. I like our odds. I'd rather be us than them. And so
Hmm.
I just think though that much we need to have a defense. We need to engage in the defensive world. But I go back to much of this competition is going to be about vaccines, technology. It's going to be about education. It's going to be about values. It's going to be about how we partner with others and how whether we're a friend, we show up as a friend or not.
Hmm.
This stuff matters. So a lot of the non-military stuff, and it gets sort of short shrift in much of the world. So I wrote this book, The American Imperative, to make an argument that this was as important, or we need to see it sort of like the defense stuff is the chocolate and the non-military stuff's the peanut butter. You need both chocolate and peanut butter for the Reese's peanut butter cup.
Hmm.
Like we need both. We can't just have chocolate and not the peanut butter. You need both for the Reese's peanut butter cup. So I think a lot of people, including in the world that I inhabit, think, oh, this is kind of hippy dippy. This is kind of tree huggery. And I'm a Republican, Pat. Like I'm not sort of a hippy dippy tree huggery kind of a person. And I would just say that like we need to understand that our forms of this is other forms of our power are really important. And so I also don't want I did wrote this book because I think there's a temptation on the left and but also on the right in the Republican Party among some to say like I'd like a timeout on global leadership. And guess what? If you make a timeout on global leadership, China has the power and ability to fill that void we leave behind. and we are not going to like it. We're not going to like it. And so I wrote this book, and why I'm so passionate about this is because we need a bipartisan consensus over the next 20 years on how to. There's a bipartisan consensus, Pat, in Washington, that we have a problem with the Chinese Communist Party. There's a bipartisan consensus we have a problem with Russia. What we don't yet have is a bipartisan consensus about what the heck to do about it. So I'm actually hoping some of the 2024 election process, and even though it's going to be really messy, and I'm going to try and like just take a vacation for 18 months and kind of skip it. I actually think the campaign process will help force a conversation in the country. We should at least force a conversation in the country about trying to forge this bipartisan consensus about what the heck to do about it. There's an agreement that we have a challenge. We don't yet have an agreement about what the heck to do about it. So I wrote this book, The American Imperative, because I want to start that conversation about what the heck to do about it. And I think a big chunk of what the heck to do about it is in the non-military sphere.
Agreed. Is there anything else that you might like to say before we wrap up?
I am so grateful to you, Pat. I want to congratulate you on launching this awesome podcast. I'm going to subscribe. What's the podcast called, Pat?
The most fascinating podcast in the world.
I love
And
the
that's
most fascinating
because
podcast in the world.
that's because of you.
All right, man.
Because of the
Thank
guests.
you. Thank you. That's awesome. That's sort of like that Frank. Do you like Frank Sinatra, Pat? I don't know if you.
Sure,
So I
I
love
do.
Frank Sinatra. He was my greatest. He was the greatest. And
Mm-hmm.
there's a song, "The Most Beautiful Girl in the World," that he has. It's a good version. It's from the '60s. You should go check
Oh,
it out. So yeah, it's not the
thank
one
you.
like the Charlie Rich one. This
Mm-hmm.
is like this other version, and it's pretty good. And so like the most fascinating podcast in the world. Like that's I thought of Frank Sinatra and "The Most Beautiful Girl in the World." I saw Sinatra 3 times live.
Oh, wow.
I broke up with a potential girlfriend when she told me Frank Sinatra's music was cheesy. Like that was a
Oh,
red line for me. That
jeez.
was a deal breaker. So when Mrs. Runde and I got married, it was sort of like that scene in Diner where, like, the guy she had to pass the test about the Baltimore Colts, and
Oh,
like my wife had to kind of pass a
funny.
test about Frank Sinatra. So that was sort of like, yeah. So anyway, so look, I'm really
Love
happy
it.
for you. Congratulations. This is really exciting, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be on your podcast today.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Thanks, Pat.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye.